The Lean Startup is a book that was written back in 2011 by Eric Ries, and it's been much hyped over the years. I disregarded reading it because I thought by a lean startup he meant being cheap and building small, minimal viable products, which seemed like a far overhyped and overdiscussed idea. Well, it turns out that my assumptions about the book were entirely inaccurate. And what I'm going to try to do in this post here, it's probably about the next 20 minutes, is to summarize this book. And so I think this will be about a 4% of the total book length, this summary. And I think the summary probably contains, maybe about 75% of the content of the book. So hopefully it's worth your time. The term lean startup, in the way that Eric uses it, comes from lean manufacturing, which is a work process developed in Japan and really exemplified by the Toyota production system. And it's a way of working designed to reduce waste and to continuously deliver the right product. I'm a big fan of lean manufacturing, as you may know. There's a post I wrote on stocking hospital supply rooms using two-bin kanbans, which has been surprisingly well read. And there's also a whole series summary on the Handbook of Healthcare System Design, which discusses in there lean manufacturing. And when Eric uses the term lean manufacturing and applies it to startups, what he's trying to do is he's trying to see every assumption about a startup. Its products, its services, its prospective customers, its marketing campaigns. Every assumption about this is a hypothesis that must be tested. And so for the startup, he says, the question isn't can it be built, but should it be built, and for whom, and can we make a sustainable business around it? The lean startup approach of customer-tested hypothesis and data-driven decisions avoids two equally problematic approaches to startups. The first is the just do it school of entrepreneurship, where people go and do things and make things happen, but don't actually learn or understand what works and what doesn't work. And the other equally problematic approach to entrepreneurship is an analysis paralysis startup, where every decision is overthought and overplanned without even getting real-world data. And so I think this is a really important book for anyone who's trying to do something new. And this blog post here is going to try to summarize these key themes. There's a number of direct quotes in the text version of this blog post you can find on gregoryschmidt.ca. I've tried to quote the book as accurately as I can, but I must admit I kind of took notes from the audio version while listening to it at the gym. There's going to be 5 main sections that we're going to go through, and these 5 sections come from Eric's Lean Startup Principles. So the 5 sections are: 1, entrepreneurship is everywhere; 2, entrepreneurship is management; 3, validated learning; 4, build, measure, learn; and 5, innovation accounting. And the header image, if you're looking at this on YouTube, which says "Stop wasting people's time," this picture comes from Eric's talks, and it's a real theme of the book about why he thinks this is important. So let's dive into part 1 on entrepreneurship is everywhere. When the term startup is used, many people associate it with the new software company. However, Eric insists that the term applies far more broadly. A startup is, as he says, a human institution designed to create a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. This means that a startup is any new or old company that is trying to find a new source of value, such as a new product, service, customer, or market. If there is no uncertainty about what to do, it wouldn't be a startup. One could just execute a well-built business plan and achieve massive success. And so Eric puts forth the concept of a lean startup as a set of practices for helping entrepreneurs increase their odds of building a successful startup. Because by definition, a startup is operating in settings of extreme uncertainty, and therefore it must view almost everything it does as a hypothesis. And this hypothesis requires testing via a build, measure, learn feedback loop, which will result in validated learning, which is kind of defined as true insights about the hypothesis. And the goal of a lean startup isn't to be cheap, but it's to accelerate the build, measure, learn feedback loop in order to continuously innovate through a process of decision-making that is data-driven and reflective of the customer's actual behavior. And critical decisions should be based not on hypothetical strategic planning or unreliable surveys or focus groups, but this method of data-driven development. And the hope is that this hypothesis data-driven approach will improve the success rate of new innovative products worldwide. So we move into part 2, how entrepreneurship is management. Of course, the traditional startup view of management is that it's a bad word, and it's viewed as something that it's stifling and too controlling for the unstructured nature of a startup. And Eric, though, strongly disagrees and says what's needed isn't the absence of management. What's needed isn't chaos, but simply a form of management which is designed for entrepreneurship. And so he calls this entrepreneurial management, which he defines as a setting which requires creating conditions that enables employees to do the kind of experimentation that entrepreneurship requires. And so in traditional management, success is executing a business plan on time and on budget. And failure to deliver a product is considered either poor planning or poor execution. Eric shifts this and says that in a startup, the only thing worse than building a bad product is building something no one wants. And so while traditional management will engage in a development process of strategic planning, which is this long and slow process based on untested hypothesis, Eric strongly suggests that management move away from strategic planning, instead towards rapid experimentation as its way forward, because experiments can start immediately. And unlike strategic planning, experiments provide real results, and if successful, those results actually become the usable products. Now, many organizations have shifted towards agile development as their way to do entrepreneurial management, and they believe they've solved their startup managerial issues. But one of the key points that Eric makes is that agile development does not provide insights about what to build for customers. Agile is just a way to make work more flexible. It's a way to work in smaller batches with small integrated teams to develop as you go, with the potential to focus on the most important thing at the time. But the question is, what is the most important thing at the time to focus on? And that's what leads us into part 3, invalidated learning. And Eric suggests that the whole purpose of the startup is to obtain validated learning, which is to demonstrate valuable truths about a business prospect, such as what to build, for whom, in order to create a sustainable business. And this must be done as quickly as possible before the startup venture runs out of funds. And so startups think they know what to build often, or they think they know who their customer archetype is. But the core truths of a startup are often taken for granted as unvalidated ideas based on leap of faith assumptions and arguments by analogy. Without actual paying customers buying the product, everything really is just a hypothesis. And so the process of validated learning breaks down the large vision that a startup has into smaller, more clear, testable hypotheses. And two critical hypotheses that must be tested early in a startup are the value hypothesis and the growth hypothesis. The value hypothesis aims to understand if the product or service actually creates value for the customers. Is this something they want? And the growth hypothesis looks at how new customers discover the product or service. And for a startup to succeed, both of these hypotheses require reliable answers. Eric's methodology of hypothesis-driven development is clear. He says, we must learn what customers really want, not what they say they want or what they think they want, but what they actually demonstrate through their behavior, essentially, in that they want. And kind of as a side comment, this is very similar to what Steve Jobs or maybe Henry Ford or others in the past have observed, in that customers actually don't know what they want. They may want, for instance, a faster horse or a better battery for their tape player. But Eric instead suggests that customers reveal their preferences by their behavior. And so the purpose of validated learning is to test every assumption about the business strategy or the product as a hypothesis and experiment with actionable metrics. And this is very unlike focus groups, which don't measure what customers actually want. And so the way which you do this experimentation process is called a build, measure, learn feedback loop, which brings us to part 4 on build, measure, learn. And now this feedback loop is really the engine of being able to generate validated learning. Now it may sound counterintuitive, but the process actually starts at the end with learn. What do we want to learn is the question that initiates the process. And so this is the hypothesis that needs to be tested, such as a business assumption, a technical issue, or a marketing plan. Build is perhaps the second step, and this is to understand what type of experiment needs to be built to test that hypothesis. And this is where the concept of a minimal viable product or an MVP comes in. Ideally, the hypothesis can be tested even without making something, such as a video MVP, or without having to develop too much, such as a smoke test MVP or a Wizard of Oz MVP. Now, the MVP in the lean startup lexicon is the way to answer specific hypothesis by building a product or service. Only those features that contribute to testing the hypothesis should be built. Any feature that is not required to test the hypothesis is considered, in lean manufacturing terms, waste. Now, of course, you have to realize that an exception to this rule is that if the idea is so small, you may not require to build it as a separate MVP. You could just build the actual idea itself for the experiment. But either way, the goal is to avoid waste in this step and to most efficiently test the hypothesis, which then takes us to the measure step. The experiment must produce metrics that are clear to interpret and can validate or refute the hypothesis. And the next section on innovation and counting will go into this in more detail. And then we come back to the learn step. After the experiment's been built and measured, we now learn to see what the results are, and we make a decision based on this data. If the hypothesis was rejected, an alternative approach might be tried. And if it was successful, that experiment can actually become itself the product. Now, Eric gives a cool example, for instance, of how Zappos, the online shoe retailer, tested their early hypothesis. And so instead of building an entire online store, what they did was they wanted to test the hypothesis, would people purchase shoes online? And so they took photos of shoes that were in physical stores, posted them online. Customers could go onto their online website, choose a shoe from the pictures available, and then the Zappos staff would go and actually buy that shoe from the store and send it to the customer. And just to end this section here, if you look at the online blog post, you'll see a graphic which shows some actual specific techniques that can be used at each stage of the build, measure, and learn feedback loop cycle. And it should be also mentioned that the whole reason that startups can't live in stealth mode is because they're unable to engage in this build, measure, learn loop. Many groups, of course, like to remain in stealth mode because really the absence of numbers invites, the possibility and imagination about the future. Whereas if you have small numbers, it might raise questions about the validity of your idea. But of course, as Eric is trying to make his point in this book, the whole purpose of a startup is to validate if the hypothesis is even correct in the first place before building out the entire hypothesis. Which brings us to the final part, number 5, on innovation accounting, which is how do we actually track this? How do we know which route to take in order to quickly kill things that don't work and to double down on those things that do? And the way to do this is to avoid what he calls vanity metrics. Now, vanity metrics present numbers such as the total number of downloads or total customers or total revenue. But these metrics do not actually reveal much about how a customer values a product. If someone downloads and deletes an application without using it, the metrics of total downloads do not demonstrate this. And the other problem is that vanity metrics can be easily influenced by success theater. For instance, a large ad spend may raise the metrics and give the outward appearance of success. But the purpose of a startup isn't simply to add new customers, but to determine if a sustainable business can be developed. And so metrics must be actionable, accessible, and audible. Actionable means that it's something that can be influenced by an experiment. Accessible means the metrics make sense to people in the organization interpreting them. And auditable means the employees must be confident that the data populating these metrics is correct and that they can validate and check it themselves. Now, one way to make metrics more useful is to connect them directly to human behavior. For instance, downloaded product or used product or upgraded to paid versions. This is much more tangible to understand than a website hit. And so Eric, for instance, tracked for a period of time 4 key metrics. One was the total number of downloads. The second was on repeat usage. The third was on repeat usage 5 times. And the fourth was the number of customers who paid money for the product. And so as you could see, focusing on these 4 metrics makes it very clear when you're running experiments if they're helping you build a sustainable business. And you'll notice in particular how retention rate metrics are often very valuable to track. The total number of downloads metric is perhaps more valuable in understanding the growth hypothesis. Is it growing, but not actually valuable in understanding the value hypothesis? Value hypothesis is much more demonstrated by repeat usage metrics or paid customer metrics. One other thing to consider is that it's very helpful to interpret metrics using cohort analysis, being able to see if over time on a rolling basis, for instance, user retention improves. And the general process of running these metrics is first, of course, you have to establish what your baseline is. Second, you have to deploy the intervention, which tests the hypothesis. And when you deploy that intervention, there's different techniques, but a common one might be split testing, where you deploy the features to a small group of users, and then you compare the results against the rest. And then, of course, third, once the data is in, you need to determine if you, as Eric says, pivot or persevere, which is to either take all of the validated learning to date and to pivot, meaning to adopt a new approach because you're unable to move your metrics closer to the ideal of what those metrics should be. Or if the metrics seem to be improving with each experiment sufficiently, you could persevere in the current approach that you're taking. Just to wrap up, 2 last ideas. The first is on 3 engines of growth that Eric outlines in the book. I think these are helpful in thinking about how to grow the startup. And essentially, the 3 engines that Eric outlines, the first is the sticky engine of growth. And this is best suited for a product where a customer might use over a long time. And when you have customers leave the product, or the churn rate, it probably means that they're very dissatisfied with the product, or they might have gone to a competitor. And so if you're using this as a primary strategy of growth, it's very important that the way which you grow is to actually retain existing customers. It's to decrease your churn rate. And the way you do that is by making the product better. And the key takeaway is that this goes against traditional ways when people think about growing a business, which usually mean marketing or sales or bringing in new customers. But the sticky engine of growth says actually, no, you want to retain your old customers as a key way of growing the business. The second is the viral engine of growth. And what this is it's a way of either through word of mouth, each customer bringing in more other customers, or it's through person-person transmission, meaning, for instance, simply the actual usage of the application or the service or the product transmits it to other people. For instance, if someone sent an email from Hotmail, the receiver of that email might see in the footer that email had been sent from Hotmail. Now, within the viral engine of growth, you can track something called a viral coefficient. For instance, if that coefficient is 0.1, it means that for every 10 users that come to the platform, it will bring an additional user. This is not a sustainable coefficient. But if the viral coefficient was greater than 1, meaning that for every 1 user that joins the platform, they bring an additional fraction of a user or another user, now very rapid growth can happen. And of course, the third engine of growth is the paid engine of growth, and this is based on funded advertising. And growth can be found by either reducing the cost to acquire a customer, your CPA, your cost per acquisition, or by increasing the revenue from each customer through the CLV, the customer lifetime value. Well, if you want to start on any of these ideas today, what Eric essentially suggests is that you can start to follow the lean startup process by building a cross-functional team that is able to take a hypothesis, build it, ship it, and measure the results. And this cross-functional team is important because it reduces the inefficiencies of handing off work between separate functional teams, each doing their own work, which are non-integrated. And by building a single cross-functional team, you're able to also connect the work that team is doing directly to the outcome of their work. So there's a higher sense of ownership because they're taking the idea both all the way from hypothesis through to development. Now, of course, this team cannot be slowed down by bureaucracy. It needs to have autonomy to be able to validate its hypotheses as required, to build a culture of split testing, continuous deployment, and customer testing. And within an organization, the lean startup approach moves you away from a leader-driven development. It moves you from a place where project managers or business analysts or leadership essentially play Caesar in making decisions to one where the organization strives to make frequent evidence-based decisions. Now, the lean startup approach is also moving you away from a decision-making strategy which a lot of groups use of compromised agreements. Now, a compromised agreement is not very good because it's the decision that's made by taking the middle ground between two parties. And there's two problems with this. The first is that the decision it's not rooted in fact. It's just rooted on this happy middle ground between two opposing parties. And the second problem with compromised agreements is that each party over time progressively will anchor their position in a more extreme way in order that the final outcome and the final middle ground is actually closer to what they were initially hoping for. And so the hope is that adopting a lean startup and data-driven approach is that you'll move away from either making decisions through leader-driven development or compromised agreements. Now, of course, the blog post links to an excerpt from the book where Eric lists 7 rules for an innovation sandbox, which goes into a little bit more tactical details on how you might create within a larger organization this opportunity for an innovation team. And to finally conclude, Eric Ries strongly believes that organizations waste tremendous personal passion, energy, and vision, as well as economic resources working on the wrong thing. And his hope is that the lean startup approach will help organizations that are operating in settings of extreme uncertainty, which is a startup, learn what they should be working on and help bring new innovative ideas more reliably to market. And why does this matter? Well, Sean Carolan said that startups don't starve, they drown. And the issue is that there's, as Eric says, quote, a zillion new ideas about how to make the product better floating around. But the hard truth is that most of those ideas only make a difference at the margins. And so the lean startup approach aims to see through the noise quickly to determine the correct path forward. And as Peter Drucker back in 1963 wrote, there is surely nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all. Anyway, I highly recommend you read or listen to the full book on the lean startup, how today's entrepreneurs use continuous innovation to create radically successful businesses. And there'll be 2 associated blog posts subsequent to this, one discussing the differences between agile, lean startup, and human-centered design, and how they're very different things, but they actually work quite well together, as well as a proposal on how these lean startup principles might work well within an open source enterprise software community.